Good morning. We want to welcome everyone to our auditorium class. For those of you who are streaming our class, we welcome you, and if you've never visited us, we would love to have you come and join us on any Sunday here. We meet about 10:15 after our worship services. Have you ever thought about the many ways that each of us is a unique creation of God? No one else on this planet has your fingerprints. They are unique to you. And your heart beats a rhythm that is distinctively yours. No two eyes are the same. The arrangement of blood vessels in the retina are formed as the eye develops before birth, and they are so unique to that particular eye that the use of technology to scan the retina is one of the most secure methods we have today of identifying someone. I understand 20,000 times more effective than that of using fingerprints. All of us have heard of DNA. Do you know what that stands for? Don't know anything, including how to spell the word no. Actually, DNA is an acronym for a large molecule found in the nucleus of every one of our body's cells. It's called deoxyribose nucleic acid, and it makes up our genetic material, our chromosomes. And unless you have an identical twin, no one on this planet has the same arrangements of amino acids in their DNA molecules that you do. And this is the reason why no one looks exactly like you. And the point I'm making is this: you are a one-of-a-kind individual. All of us are unique. Peter writes, "You are members of God's chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, His special possession." Now, when you think about it, these words could be used to describe the Israelites of the Old Testament, couldn't they? Now, here's the ironic thing about being unique people. As distinct as we are as human beings and as children of God, there is a relentless pressure to conform to the pattern of this world. And even though we are unique, even though the Israelites were unique, we drift into behaviors of what everyone else is doing. And that makes us indistinguishable from the people of the world. Thinking about what we've been studying, how many times did the Lord warn the Israelites not to conform to the ways and lifestyles of their pagan neighbors? Time and again, we read in the books of the Old Testament about their compromise. Even Solomon, when he negotiated and conceded with those who bowed down to Satan by worshiping false gods, this wisest man who ever lived eventually turned away from God himself, and Solomon also bowed down to Satan. We are studying lessons from a series called The Gospel Project, which surveys the entire Bible, the Old and the New Testaments, and we've been focusing on what happened to the Israelites after Solomon died and the great kingdom of David was divided. The northern kingdom of Israel, shown in blue on this map, has not existed for over 100 years. The land having fallen to the Assyrians and the people taken into captivity as their slaves. And after that, it is as if they disappeared from the earth. There is no record of them after that point. In the southern kingdom, shown in yellow, the prophet Zephaniah declared that an imminent day of the Lord was fast approaching, and for their religious and moral and national sins that have been ongoing for over 400 years, God has decided to bring judgment on His covenant people and cut them off. God is going to let them fall into the hands of their enemies. He's going to take away this good land that He gave them, as He promised He would, if they bowed down to Satan through the worship of false gods. And this decision is final and irrevocable. Through Zephaniah, God tells His people, I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. In 34 short years, what was once the mightiest nation in the world at the time would be left in ruin, and the people taken into captivity to become the slaves of their enemies. A repeat of what happened to the northern kingdom. A repeat of the days of their ancestors in Egypt when they cried out to God for deliverance. Today we'll be focusing on the last 26 years of a great nation whose overall history lasted 350 years. And if you want to follow along, we'll be exploring the first 20 verses of 2 Chronicles 36, and we'll support that with verses from the last 3 chapters of 2 Kings. And what all of these scriptures are about can be reduced to these 3 one-syllable words: the end has come. Through the decisions of their last 5 kings, 4 of whom we are told did evil in the eyes of the Lord, we can see the steps that led to the decline and ultimate destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the land of Judah, as one by one their most important national resources slipped away. The first national asset that Judah lost was its independence. Now here's what happened. Judah's last king, Josiah, was a godly man who sincerely wanted to please God. The final years of Josiah's reign saw tremendous changes on the international scene. Nineveh, Assyria's magnificent capital city, had finally fallen under the combined attacks of the Persians, the Medes, and the Babylonians in 612 BC. And with their loss of Nineveh, Assyria's reign of terror in the ancient Near East came to an end. And what was left of their army fled to a fortification on the Euphrates River named Carchemish, shown on this map. Now Nineveh is circled, it's in the center, there's a circle around it. If you look just to the left of Nineveh, you'll see Carchemish, and that's where they fled to. Pharaoh Necho, who ruled Egypt from 610 to 595 BC, set out with his army to join the weakened Assyrian forces and back them in their desperate last-ditch effort to take back Nineveh and some of the other cities that they had lost. Now that would require Necho's passing through territory that belonged to the kingdom of Judah. And King Josiah refused to give his permission to allow Necho and his army to pass through. But Necho did it anyway. While Josiah was king, we read in 2 Chronicles, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the Euphrates River on behalf of the king of Assyria. See, they were allies. Now Necho was on his way to reinforce the Assyrians at Carchemish. Now Josiah didn't like it when he learned how Necho had defied him and was marching his army on territory that belonged to Judah. And thinking that any friend of the Assyrians was his enemy, Josiah quickly moved his own army to the plains of Megiddo to challenge Necho in combat. Now this image shows Megiddo today, where that fighting occurred, and if you look in the background, you'll see Mount Carmel. Now, little did Josiah realize that he was fighting on the wrong side. His real enemy was always Babylon. Now, before the battle began, Necho sent messengers to Josiah saying, "What quarrel is there, king of Judah, between you and me? It is not you I am attacking, but the house with which I am at war, that house being the Babylonians. And then what he says next is really surprising. God has told me to hurry, so stop opposing God who is with me, or he will destroy you. Now, I find that astounding. Did God indeed reveal this to Necho, or did he just make it up? This is such a fantastic claim. Was it true or not? In either case, Josiah disregarded this dispatch, which turned out to be a fatal mistake for meddling in Egypt's affairs. Fighting King Necho was a personal decision that Josiah made on his own part. It wasn't something that God told him to do. Josiah just took matters in his own hands without consulting the prophets Zephaniah or Jeremiah and to find out what God wanted him to do. And whenever kings in the Old Testament would do that, most of the time things did not go well, and that they certainly did not go well here. King Josiah marched out to meet him in battle, but Necho faced him and killed him at Megiddo. Even more tragic than the death of Josiah was the manner in which his death occurred. Disguising himself, just like Ahab had done 245 years earlier, and hoping to avoid the deadly wound that he must have suspected would be coming from God, from what Necho had said. In the heat of this battle, he was pierced by an arrow, and he was taken back to Jerusalem, and he died shortly after that. And we can't help but wonder, did God maybe allow this to happen just to save him the pain and sorrow of seeing the kingdom come to an end? We don't know. But Egypt and Assyria failed in their attempt to drive the Babylonians out of Syria. But Necho's defeat of Josiah at Megiddo left Jerusalem wide open. And Pharaoh Necho went in and took it a few months later after this battle. Now, with the death of Josiah, the southern kingdom of Judah lost their independence and became subject to Egypt. Now, it was the first time since God had led them out of their bondage in Egypt that they were subjects of another nation. And I think it's ironic that once again they are in Egypt's hand. This lasted for 3 years, from 609 to 606 BC, the year when Nebuchadnezzar and his mighty army of Babylon defeated Egypt and gained control of Jerusalem. God had called Israel to be a people who live apart and not to consider themselves in fellowship with people of the surrounding nations. Their faith was to be in the Lord only, not in treaties, not in alliances, not in clever diplomats or secret diplomacies. It was Solomon who moved Israel from its separated position into the arena of international politics. He married 700 wives, most of whom represented treaties with foreign governments. Now, these treaties brought wealth to the kingdom. They kept warfare out. But in the end, both Solomon and the Israelites were drawn into the idolatry of the nations around them, just as God said they would. Now, had Israel obeyed God and kept his commandment, he would have put them at the head above all other nations. But in their disobedience, this resulted in God's judgment on them, and he used other nations as the means for bringing his judgment on them. Unfortunately, today's churches have followed Israel's bad example. Many have conceded and made compromises with the world. They've disobeyed God when they listened to the world and not listened to God. In that regard, churches have sinned. True believers in God are in the world, but they are not of the world. And as we've heard it said, the church does most for the world when it is least like the world. People of God are to be unique. The first step that led to the downfall of Jerusalem and the southern kingdom was the loss of their independence. Now, the rest of what happened had to do with the 4 kings who followed Josiah. Josiah had 4 sons. His first son, all we know is his name, and that probably indicates that he died in childhood. He had 3 other sons. Eliakim was the oldest, Mattaniah was the middle son, and Shallum was the youngest son. Now, after Josiah was killed and before Jerusalem fell to the Egyptians, the people put his youngest son, Shallum, on the throne, and for some unknown reason, they just bypassed the 2 oldest sons. In order to maintain order and secure the compliance of the Jews while they were under the Egyptians' control, Pharaoh Necho would rule Judah through puppet kings, and at some point in the remaining 22 years of the southern kingdom, all 3 of Josiah's sons and 1 grandson would sit on the throne, and they would be the last 4 kings of Judah. Now, thinking things would go better if the Jews were to believe that God approved and recognized his position, Necho left Shallum on the throne, but he changed his name. He changed his name to Jehoahaz. The first 4 letters of that name are the same as God's name. And he did the same thing to Eliakim, changing his name to Jehoiakim. And later, Nebuchadnezzar would change the name of Mattaniah to Zedekiah, which means the Lord is just. Now, each one of these 4 kings had a hand in the final destruction of Judah. Jehoahaz reigned only 3 months, but what he did in that short time frame was enough for it to be recorded with these all too familiar words, and Jehoahaz did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his predecessors had done. You know, at one time in the day of Solomon, the king of Egypt held the king of Judah in such high regard that he gave Solomon his own daughter to marry. But these are not the days of Solomon. Now, we don't know the circumstances behind why Necho removed Jehoahaz as king, but it's evident that Necho quickly realized that Jehoahaz was not fit for a throne, and so he deposed him. And he remained in Jerusalem as temporary overlord until he named a replacement. Now, Pharaoh Necho had Jehoahaz bound in chains, and he took him with him to Egypt, where Jehoahaz eventually died. Now, we don't know the details of his death, but this is the prophecy that Jeremiah gave concerning that. Do not weep for the dead king, now that would be Josiah, or mourn his loss. Rather, weep bitterly for him who is exiled, now that would be Jehoahaz, because he will never return nor see his native land again. So when Necho decided to return to Egypt with his army and his prisoner Jehoahaz, he made Josiah's oldest brother Eliakim king, changing his name to Jehoiakim. The second national asset that Judah lost was their land, and it happened during the reign of Jehoiakim. Now, to pay tribute to Necho, Jehoiakim put additional taxes on the people of the land, the equivalent to $400 million. Now, the Bible tells us Jehoiakim was a wicked man. Now, here's one example that we're told in Jeremiah to illustrate the point. Now, Uriah, son of Shemaiah from Kiriath Jearim, was another man who prophesied in the name of the Lord. He prophesied the same things against the city and this land as Jeremiah did. When King Jehoiakim and all his officers and officials heard his words, the king was determined to put him to death. But Uriah heard of it and fled in fear to Egypt. King Jehoiakim, however, sent Elnathan, son of Akbar, to Egypt along with some other men. They brought Uriah out of Egypt and took him to King Jehoiakim, who had him beheaded with a sword and his body thrown into the graves of the common people. Now, when that happened, God had Jeremiah to announce that King Jehoiakim would not be mourned after he died, and that he would die. He would be his burial would be that of a donkey, his funeral. And when the words of that prophecy reached him, King Jehoiakim cut to pieces and burned to ashes the scroll of Jeremiah's prophecy. So unlike his father Josiah, Jehoiakim had no respect for the Lord or his word. Now in the meantime, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, invaded portions of Judah. King Jehoiakim realized there was no way that he could go up against Babylon, and so he worked out a deal and agreed to pay tribute to Nebuchadnezzar to avoid war. And so King Jehoiakim was now sending the equivalent of just under $1 billion annually to two foreign powers, Egypt and Babylon. Now this went on for 3 years. This new empire of Babylon was quickly replacing Egypt as Judah's greatest enemy and master. Nebuchadnezzar, their king, attacked Egypt at Carchemish in 605 BC. Now that battle was fierce. It lasted for weeks. It ended in a stalemate. And Nebuchadnezzar returned to Babylon to re-equip and strengthen his forces, planning for a re-engagement later. Now in Jerusalem, King Jehoiakim falsely concluded this was a retreat by Nebuchadnezzar, and that Egypt was strong enough to resist Babylon. And so after 3 years as a vassal king, Jehoiakim rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar and refused to pay any more tribute. Now that angered Nebuchadnezzar, but he didn't do anything about it until he could arrive at Jerusalem and deal with Jehoiakim personally. What he did do, he ordered the armies of some of his other vassal nations to attack and raid Judah. And this was ongoing. Now these raids were but a prelude to the great invasion of Judah that would lead to the destruction of the land and to the temple. Now the circumstances of the death of King Jehoiakim, we have to piece those together from what we read here and there in the books of 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Jeremiah. But at some point, Nebuchadnezzar sent officers to Jerusalem, and they captured Jehoiakim. They bound him up and took him to Babylon to face King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, most likely he was executed. Jehoiakim reigned for 11 years, but during that time, Judah got more and more trouble with the surrounding nations, and they lost much of their territory. And the once great nation of Judah was reduced mostly to just the city of Jerusalem. Now, Jeremiah had warned Jehoiakim that he would die a dishonorable death without a burial. And when he did die, his body was thrown into some pit far from Jerusalem. Jehoiakim lived a disgraceful life. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and it was befitting that he was buried in such a disgraceful way, certainly not one befitting of a king. And so with the removal of King Jehoiakim, the Babylonians took control of Judah. Now, believing that God was with Nebuchadnezzar, King Necho of Egypt decided he was going to let it go. He did not challenge the Babylonians. He gave them the land, and so he left them completely alone, and never in his lifetime did he go back into that country. So having lost their independence, having lost their land, most of it to the Babylonians, the next step that occurred to bring about the end of the southern kingdom was they lost their wealth and their leading people. And this happened during the short reign of the next king. From Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar appointed Jehoiakim's son and grandson of Josiah to be the new king of Judah. His name was Jehoiakim. Now, 3 months after placing Jehoiakim on the throne, Nebuchadnezzar decided to make his move and return to Jerusalem to punish the city for defying him. When he arrived, Jehoiakim led the royal family and the leaders of the nation in surrendering to Nebuchadnezzar, something that Jeremiah had prophesied. The Babylonians took the king's treasures as well as the treasures from the Lord's temple. They stripped the temple of every bit of the gold that was in it. And then they deported to Babylon over 10,000 key people, including members of the royal family, government officials, valuable craftsmen, all to be trained for service in the king's court and filling much needed positions and offices in the growing Babylonian empire. And among those who were taken was a young priest by the name of Ezekiel, who would eventually prophesy after the destruction of Jerusalem. And also among the deported at this time was Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, all this was merely a taste of what was going to happen in 9 more years when Nebuchadnezzar invaded. As to what happened to Jehoiakim after he was taken to Babylon, well, he was held prisoner for 37 years, and during that entire time, he was not allowed to speak a single word. And whenever Nebuchadnezzar would display his captive kings to his guests, it was always the throne of Jehoiakim that he prized and placed above all the others. Jehoiakim was later released by Nebuchadnezzar's son, and he was treated kindly after that. He even ate at the king's table daily. The last step that led to the end of the southern kingdom was they lost their city of Jerusalem and the great temple with it. Now, the king who replaced Jehoiakim was his uncle and brother to Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim, and he was the middle son of Josiah. His given name was Mattaniah. And Nebuchadnezzar, if you'll remember, changed his name to Zedekiah, meaning the Lord is just. To give someone another name is to make it clear that one has power over that person. And the loss of Mattaniah's name symbolized a loss of power. No longer did Judah control its destiny. That was going to be controlled by Babylonia. Zedekiah was the 20th king of Judah. He was the last to sit on the throne of David. And he reigned for 11 years. He pretended to submit to Babylon, while at the same time he courted Egypt, and he listened to advisors who were clearly pro-Egyptian. Now, Zedekiah had taken an oath in the name of the Lord God that he would be faithful to the king of Babylon. So openly, Zedekiah maintained diplomatic contact with Babylon. He even visited the court of Nebuchadnezzar. But in secret, he sent representatives, envoys, to seek the help of the new Pharaoh of Egypt, whose name was Hophra. And in the first year of Zedekiah's reign as king, there was a second deportation of people, and another 10,000 of Judah's best young men were sent to Babylon to be trained for official service. Zedekiah was determined that no other of Jerusalem's best would be sent to Babylon to serve King Nebuchadnezzar. And he was also incensed at having to pay so much tribute money. And in 588 BC, Zedekiah asked Hophra to help him revolt against Babylon. Now, Nebuchadnezzar found out what was going on almost as soon as the clockworks were set in motion, and he marched his army to Jerusalem to attack. But before he got there, word came that the Egyptians were just east of Jerusalem. And he thought that it wasn't best to fight a war on 2 fronts, and so he decided to let Jerusalem go for the moment and face the king of Egypt. And there's an interesting thing that happened to Zedekiah at this point. God sent Jeremiah to warn Zedekiah that Nebuchadnezzar would return, and that when he did, he should surrender in order to save the city and to save the temple. But Zedekiah's faith was not in the Lord, it was in Egypt. And so Zedekiah took matters into his own hands and moved quickly to form a military alliance against Nebuchadnezzar to keep him at bay. So in addition to Egypt, the alliance included help from the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Phoenicians. But it was mostly Egypt that Nebuchadnezzar was concerned about. Now, this time, the battle between Nebuchadnezzar's forces and those of Egypt and the allies of Judah did not end in a stalemate. Nebuchadnezzar stopped Egypt and drove them back. And concerning this, the Bible reads, "And the king of Egypt came not again any more out of his land. For the king of Babylon had taken from the river of Egypt," that would be the Nile, "unto the river of Euphrates all that pertained to the king of Egypt." The other allies of Zedekiah were overwhelmed as well, and this was the last battle any of those nations would ever fight. And so after defeating them all, the Babylonian army turned towards Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem full force. The wall around the city seemed impregnable. He began it in January, and the assault lasted a year and a half. And near the end of the assault, there was a famine. Hunger and starvation in Jerusalem was so severe. We read this in Jeremiah's Lamentations. "Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of famine. Racked with hunger, they waste away for lack of food from the field." Desperate, the people resorted to cannibalism. The women cooked and ate their own children. Once again, Jeremiah counseled Zedekiah and his officers to surrender to Nebuchadnezzar's army in order to save the city and the temple. And again, they were refused. And then Zedekiah asked that Jeremiah pray for him. And Jeremiah suggested that the king pray to God himself. That angered Zedekiah. He was the king of Judah. The king of Judah does not pray to any god. And so, calling Jeremiah a traitor, Zedekiah ordered the court guard to get rid of him. And so they carried Jeremiah out of the city to an abandoned cistern and threw him in it to die. And fortunately, someone came along and rescued him. The Babylonian invaders broke through the walls and took the city. They looted and destroyed homes, houses. They set fire to the city and the temple too in August. Now, realizing that the city and the temple were all lost, Zedekiah fled the city with his family and his officers. And on the run for just a few days, they were intercepted on the plains of Jericho. Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers also captured the religious leaders of the city, the priests who had polluted God's house with idols, those who had broken their covenant with God, as well as the king's staff and all those who opposed Jeremiah, including the ones who tried to kill him. They were all slaughtered before Nebuchadnezzar at a place called Riblah. And the people of Jerusalem who were left were taken away to Babylon, where they would be slaves. Now, for what happened to Zedekiah, we have to go to the prophecies of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. The words of Jeremiah regarding Nebuchadnezzar and the fate of King Zedekiah, the last king. "You will not escape from his grasp, but you will surely be captured and given into his hands. You will see the king of Babylon with your own eyes, and he will speak with you face to face, and you will go to Babylon." These are the words of Ezekiel regarding the fate of King Zedekiah. "The prince among them will put his things on his shoulder at dusk." Now this is referring to Zedekiah. "And leave, and a hole will be dug in the wall for him to go through. I will spread my net for him, and he will be caught in my snare. I will bring him to Babylon, the land of the Chaldeans, but he will not see it, for there he will die." So here we have two prophecies that pose for us a riddle. How could Zedekiah see the king of Babylon and not see the city of Babylon? Well, here's the answer. Zedekiah did see King Nebuchadnezzar. Zedekiah was found guilty of treason and rebellion against the king of Babylon, and he's sentenced to be exiled. Now, if you'll look carefully in the lower left corner of this image, you'll see some people lying on the floor. To give Zedekiah one last tormenting memory, the Babylonians killed his sons right before his eyes. Next, the court guards gouged out Zedekiah's eyes, and after that, Zedekiah could not see Babylon. Now, Zedekiah lived in Babylon until his death, and in fulfillment of God's promise through Jeremiah, Zedekiah was given a state funeral. He certainly did not deserve it. He lived in such dishonor, but the Lord God did it for the sake of David, who had founded this dynasty. So in hindsight, we can see the consequences of the decisions made by the last 5 kings of Judah that led to the end of that once great nation. By not listening to God, and in some cases overtly disobeying Him, the Jews lost everything. And we might add one more thing. They lost all hope for things ever again to be what they once were. God told them He would take away the good land He had given them if they did not repent and stop bowing down to false gods. And so, coming to the close of this record of the tragic and decline and destruction of a great nation, we'll keep it simple and say this: there's one all-encompassing takeaway for us. How far a nation rises and sustains itself is directly related to how its people worship God. The nation of Israel was torn into 2 kingdoms because of the sins of Solomon, who turned to idols to please his foreign wives. Now, following his example, every king of the northern kingdom who sat on the throne forsook the one true God and worshiped idols. In doing so, they worshiped Satan, and God used the Assyrian nation to judge Israel by taking them into captivity. And to this day, what happened to them is still a mystery. And it didn't take long for the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom to succumb by worshiping Satan. And eventually, God used Babylon to judge His own people and to bring about the downfall of Jerusalem. I thought about this verse in the Psalms, and to paraphrase this verse, we become like the God we worship. And if we refuse to worship the only true and living God, we become as helpless as the idols that enthrall and beguile us. The kings who led Israel and Judah astray were conformers. They were weak leaders who often followed the crowd and to please the people. God warned them of their foolhardiness by raising up prophets who were distinctively different and unique in that they sought to please the Lord, and they stepped forward and spoke the truth, whatever the cost. And so should it be with us. Well, I thank you for the chance to teach the class during this quarter. This is my last lesson. We have one more to go. Larry Phelps will be leading the class next week. You've been a great group and very forgiving. And if any of you have any concerns or complaints about anything you heard today, I see Lewis Moore is still sitting back there. As always, he'll make himself available to take your concerns and place them gently in file 13. Have a good day.